Hearts of Stone by C.T. Stewart. Sharp-edged stalactites shimmered in the glow of wall-mounted braziers, their flickering firelight dancing across carved pillars older than any record. Far below, the red peak mountains stretched the halls of Thraegor, crafted through centuries of painstaking chiseling and dwarven resolve. This had once been a place of vigilance and strife, an unyielding bastion during the War of the Blind Wyrms, when colossal serpents ravaged entire holds with searing fire and tremors that shook the very bedrock. Those bitter years claimed countless dwarven lives, casting the realm into despair. Out of that darkness rose the mighty dwarf lord, Fenton Thraegor, whose hammer blows shattered worm scales with brutal dwarven vengeance. His sonorous battle cries rallied the fearful in every hall. Neither flames nor deafening roars could break his will, and under his triumphant banner the four separate but connected underground cities and their respective ruling houses resolved to unite under the single name Thraegor with one king, a lasting tribute to the hero who united them in victory. In the fateful battle of the deepest cavern, Fenton Thraegor gave his life alongside the last of the great worms. His sword, which he had taken to utilizing the last few months against the worms, an uncommon thing for a dwarf, was buried deep into its neck. Since that day, no worm's roar had been heard under the Red Peak Mountains, and a hard-won peace settled like fine dust on untouched shelves. Within this blessed respite, 4 dwarven juveniles gathered in one of Thraegor's many forges. A narrow beam of golden light streamed through a hidden shaft in the vaulted cavern ceiling, casting dancing motes across the rough-hewn stone floor. The air smelled faintly of charcoal and polished iron, unmistakable evidence of dwarven industry. Beyond a stout workbench piled with tools, the 4 dwarves busied themselves with youthful determination. Their voices bounced off the stone walls, full of vigor. "Rorgrim, pass me that hammer," came a bright, high-pitched shout from behind a massive iron anvil. Belly, copper-haired, freckle-faced, and only head and shoulders taller than the anvil itself, grinned, cheeks red from some unknown effort. Rorgrim snorted, then brushed a strand of ash-blonde hair from his eyes. "If Master Stonebrand catches us, he'll have us all polishing helmets for a week." He handed the hammer over to Belly. "Here." A loud thud filled the cavernous forge as Baldrim, tallest of the 4, though still a head shorter than a full-grown dwarf, brought a practice axe down upon a wooden dummy. He held a teasing lilt in his voice. "Don't drop it, runt." "I'm not a runt," Belly shot back, though a hint of a grin still curved his lips. "Just wait. When the day comes and I sit on the throne of Thraegor, you'll be bowing to me." A small chorus of laughter erupted. Durzak, broader in the shoulders than all except Baldrim, poked his sooty face out from beneath a half-raised visor. "Oh, aye, Belly. I'll bow so low you might think I'm studying the stone masterwork as hard as Rorgrim studies his scrolls." He wrinkled his nose. "But right now, let's see if you can even lift that hammer without smashing your toes." Belly hefted the hammer, wincing slightly at its weight. "I'll do more than lift it. I'll show you what real forging looks like." Determination gleamed in his eyes. "I just need a second to, warm up." The dwarven boys giggled as Baldrim dreamed aloud. "Everyone knows we need a warrior king to rule the dwarven realms. Who is our great city named after anyway? If they put you on the throne, Belly, it would be a matter of time before they beg for me to take over." "Warrior king?" Rorgrim teased, arching an eyebrow. "Last week you got your beard singed, sneaking too close to the foundry's fires. Maybe learn to dodge an ember or two first." Baldrim's face tinted red as Belly howled with laughter, but he managed a wry grin. "At least I don't confuse the quenching vat with the wash tub like Durzak did," clearly deflecting attention from himself. Durzak's protest came in a spluttering cough. "We don't speak of that day. I was half asleep." All of them erupted into more hushed giggles that ricocheted around the high-ceiling chamber, each of them glancing toward the door they suspected Master Stonebrand to appear from at any moment. In the flicker of torchlight, their youthful faces glowed with the hope for the possibility of their futures. They noticed a group of dwarven youth about their age outside the forge, staring at them briefly before scuttling on their way. It was not uncommon for the youth their age to stop and stare at the 4 firstborn sons of the high dwarven houses. These were the houses that had united to create the single kingdom of Thraegor. Each of the dwarven princes would be considered as possible successor to the current king, part of the pact that was made when the kingdom was forged. But the jealous whispers about the 4 little mountain whelps rarely reached the ears of the boys, the other dwarven youngsters too reverential to be caught speaking openly against them. After a long silence, Rorgrim tapped a restless finger against his chest, his thoughtful gaze flicking from Baldrim to Durzak to Belly. "I've read in the old archives about strife between the houses during previous successions," he began quietly. "Do you all think our friendship can survive that?" Baldrim, leaning on his wooden practice axe, spoke up first. "My father claims Durzak here might need a lesson in humility one day." Durzak gave a short laugh. "Funny, because mine often says the same about you. The difference is that my family's coffers are thrice the size of yours." Before tension could flare, Belly interjected, setting aside a half-formed piece of iron with a clang. "We're brothers. Whatever happens, we must serve whoever is named king. We can't have 4 kings. It's inevitable that 3 of us will need to follow the 4th. They exchanged silent nods, punctuating the weight of Belly's words. Dust motes drifted through the amber glow of nearby torches. Belly cleared his throat. "We should make a pact." "A pact?" Rorgrim echoed thoughtfully, tapping a parchment tucked into his belt. "History shows us dwarven unity can be brittle," he admitted. "But if we swear this oath now, maybe together we can spare our kingdom the heartache of striving houses. If we do it right, all our children can grow up with the same friendship we have," Durzak echoed hopefully. Baldrim leaned on his wooden practice axe, still stinging slightly from Rorgrim and Durzak's earlier jibes. "The only battle I want is against orcs and beasts, not my own friends." A moment passed, and he gave Durzak a wry smile. "Your father's wealth may end up in my coffers yet, when my strength is needed on the battlefield." Durzak snorted, crossing his arms over a soot-stained apron. "Aye, you learn to dodge embers, and we'll see about a paycheck for your heroics someday, warrior dwarf." They all chuckled again. Rorgrim took a decisive step forward. "We need a symbol, something as unbreakable as dwarven steel." Belly shot each of them a firm look. "Let's do it here. This anvil has seen more forging than any in the kingdom. Let's trust it to hold our vow." Baldrim tapped his axe on the stone floor, the muffled thud sending tiny echoes through the chamber. "If we're forging a pledge, let's keep it simple. A single symbol from each of us, forged into a keepsake that only means something to us, something that to us is as strong as the sigils of our houses." They all nodded in agreement as the 4 young dwarves formed a circle around the large anvil. The heat of the forge fanned their faces, and torchlight gleamed off growing beads of sweat. Not far away, fresh embers crackled in the brazier, filling the air with the tang of scorched metal. Each dwarf chose their desired symbol for the emblem they were about to forge, together with quiet excitement. Belly chose a wolf, practically in love with them ever since his family had found a wolf mother that had given birth to a litter of pups. Durzak chose a badger. He had always admired them for their digging abilities. Baldrim chose an axe, representing his love for combat and desire to become a great warrior. Rorgrim thought the longest, considering each of the other sigils before selecting his own. They set to work, sparks dancing in the gloom. Belly carefully softened the scraps over glowing coals. Durzak braced the molten pieces on the anvil. Baldrim swung the hammer in measured arcs, and Rorgrim offered guidance gleaned from an old smithing manual. Their laughter mingled with the crackle of embers whenever someone fumbled a tool. At last they poured glowing metal into a single mold 4 separate times. When cooled enough to handle, each dwarven youth held a small figurine that brought smiles all around. A badger rode atop a large, vicious wolf, with an axe held high above its head in its left hand and a large tome clutched to its chest in its right. Belly tilted the curious token in the torchlight as he studied the rough edges. "I love it," he said, voice tinged with satisfaction. "Let's remember this. Our wolf-riding badger axe knight who can't put down a good book." They burst out laughing. A warm hush settled over them, the anvil cooling from its recent use. Rorgrim held up the figurine high above them. "May this be a symbol of our pact to serve this kingdom, and whoever is named its king, our pact to remain friends and brothers forever." The mountain seemed hushed in that brief moment, as though it paused to listen. Belly broke the silence. "Then let it be sealed. Our houses might have their squabbles, but the 4 of us will stand as one." They all cheered in agreement so loudly that Master Stonebrand heard the commotion and stormed in from a side passage. His calloused hand clutched a heavy hammer, and the fury on his face rivaled anything the boys had seen before. "Who gave you leave to meddle with my things?" he thundered, glaring at the red glow from the forge. "You'll ruin good metals, you scoundrels." Baldrim's eyes widened. "Scatter!" he hissed, clutching his practice axe. Rorgrim scrambled to hide the figurine in his belt pouch. Durzak fumbled to set down a metal rod without clanking it too loudly. Belly snatched a smoldering scrap off the anvil, nearly singeing his fingers. Stonebrand lifted the hammer high. "You're as rowdy as weasels," he bellowed. A raucous chorus of laughter and frantic apologies echoed as the dwarves darted from the chamber. Their boots slapped against the stone of the dwarven halls in a clumsy rhythm, hearts pounding with equal measures of mischief and triumph. They rushed into the shadows of Thraegor's corridors, giggling uncontrollably at Stonebrand's booming curses and the loud crash of the forge door slamming shut. As the seasons rolled on beneath the Red Peak Mountains, each of the 4 dwarf princes found his own life charting a distinct course, one shaped as much by personal ambition as by the traditions of Thraegor. Baldrim, restless for battle and glory, spent long hours swinging his axe in the training yards, driven by the stories of old dwarf lords he once idolized as a child. When orcs began to appear near their mountain, it was the bravery of Baldrim Deepaxe and the warriors of House Deepaxe that answered the call of the king. He and his dwarven shield brothers quickly gained fame as the kingdom's finest warriors, Baldrim chief of them all. Durzak, drawn to the deep hum of pickaxes and the lure of hidden veins of ore, poured his energies into expanding forgotten tunnels and negotiating lucrative trade deals, forging a burgeoning empire of metal and coin more quickly than any dwarven lord had previously thought possible. It was rumored that his wealth might surpass that of the king himself. Belly grew inseparable from his beloved wolves. He walked mountain passes few dared to tread, as he was often called on for scouting missions due to his unique survival skills. Dwarven hunters passing through from another land had introduced Belly to the new technology of flintlock rifles, intricate muzzle-loaded weapons that required precision and patience. Fascinated by the power and challenge, Belly spent night after night tinkering with these new mechanisms in secret. Before long, he could forge his own rifles and hit targets at distances that no other marksman could. His father's initial horror at these noisy contraptions soon yielded to pride when Belly demonstrated his skill in protecting trade caravans from roaming goblins. Rorgrim, ever the scholar, withdrew into shadowy alcoves of the royal archives, transcribing documents, learning the ancient dwarvish languages, diplomacy, economics, and poring over cryptic tales of old wars and lost heirlooms. Though their fraternal bonds lingered, each dwarf's path hardened day by day along its own course, etched into the stonework of duty and desire. Early one winter morning, a pale glow crept across the snow-dusted valley outside Thraegor's eastern gate. Though the snowstorm had passed, biting winds hissed around the fortifications, lifting powdery drifts into almost blizzard-like conditions. Clumps of freshly fallen snow clung to balustrades and dwarven statues, turning the rugged landscape into a muted tableau of white and gray. Baldrim trudged at the head of a weary patrol, axe at his hip, cloak pulled tight about his shoulders, breath steaming from both dwarves and ponies alike. His warriors followed him single file, bruises and torn leathers testifying to a brutal night spent driving off an orc raiding party. Though the dwarves had scattered the marauders, one single orc had fled toward their home, deeper into the pines near the entrance to their mountain, an elusive figure they refused to let escape. "Captain," one of Baldrim's men rasped, eyeing the dark silhouettes of pine trees beyond. "Any sign?" Baldrim shook his head, fatigue heavy in his voice.
"No, but we don't go home until we find him."
They had been following tracks in the snow, footprints wide and clumsy at first, but then masked by the shifting snowdrifts.
"Stay alert. He can't have gone far."
His men murmured complaints about the unkind hour and the numbing cold, but Baldrim pressed on with stoic resolve. They slowly and cautiously advanced into the dim light of the valley, tired from exhaustion and the tension of their search. An unexpected movement suddenly caught Baldrim's eye, a dark, sleek shape darting behind a crooked pine, low to the ground as if sneaking behind them. He raised his mailed fist quickly and firmly, with clear meaning to signal a halt to his men. One of the dwarves lifted his crossbow, but Baldrim gestured him aside, adrenaline spiking through his fatigue. He wanted to see to this one personally. His father's words to him echoed in his mind. No orc left unpunished. The shape emerged again between the frosted trunks, disturbingly quick. Baldrim, half blinded by the swirling snow, acted almost on instinct. He hoisted a throwing axe, letting it fly with practiced force. A strangled yelp tore through the stillness. The dwarves rushed forward, torchlight flickering off patches of ice-crusted bark. Baldrim stumbled to the spot where his axe had landed. His breath caught when he saw a wolf sprawled in the red-stained snow, one limp foreleg bent awkwardly, eyes wide with pain. A hush descended, broken only by the moaning wind and quiet murmurs of the wolf. Baldrim sank to one knee, cursing himself as he pulsed with regret. Boots crunched on the snow behind him. He immediately knew by the sound who it was. Belly appeared, rifle slung across his back, cheeks flushed from the cold and from alarm. His gaze moved from Baldrim to the dying wolf, and a look of horror contorted his face.
"No. No.
Belly whispered, his voice cracking.
You."
Baldrim's throat constricted.
"We were chasing an orc. I thought—"
"You thought my Dusky was an orc?"
Belly interrupted with stern consternation. He knelt by the wolf, trembling fingers pressing against its blood-matted fur. Snow clung to the beast's muzzle, breath hitching in weak gasps.
"She was just patrolling the outskirts,"
he managed, frosted tears beading under his eyes.
"I just let her out to stretch, to hunt rabbits. Ow, she's—"
His voice broke. Baldrim bowed his head. heat rising in his cheeks despite the cold.
I swear, Belly, I didn't know.
The wolf let out a ragged whine, gaze fixed on Belly. With a last shuddering breath, it went still. Belly let out a soft sob, his shoulders shaking. Around them, the dwarven soldiers watched, some looking away from the raw pain they saw in Belly.
She'd never have harmed you.
Belly whispered, brushing a hand over the wolf's flank.
By the halls of our fathers. Baldrim, how could you be so careless?
Baldrim swallowed hard, wanting to say more, but his pride of being in front of his men clamped down on his urge to apologize, or to go to Belly's side and hug him.
We saw movement.
He rasped.
We thought it was the orc. We had to ensure.
Belly cut him off again, glaring, tears still wet on his cheeks.
Your men? Your orcs? Your battles?
He spat.
One of my wolves is dead, and there's just no good reason for it.
A shaky hush followed. Baldrim moved over to the wolf, clenched his fist around the haft of his axe, and pulled it out. There was no easy way to do that in front of Belly.
I'm sorry.
He managed at last, voice taut with unspoken sorrow.
Truly.
Belly's lips twisted as if he might lash out physically. Instead, he scooped the wolf's body into his arms, cradling it gently.
Learn the difference between an orc and a wolf,
He murmured bitterly.
If you can't, then you don't belong with an axe in your hand.
He paused before adding a final mocking word.
Warrior.
He sneered. Baldrim stiffened, glancing away. Belly's words stung as they always had when he was upset.
We did what we must,
He said, though the words felt hollow. Belly strode off, trudging through the knee-deep snow, the wolf's lifeless form clutched against his chest. The whipping wind continued to howl, as if mourning the passing of a companion. None of the dwarves dared speak until Belly disappeared into the white haze. The wind continued to gust, ruffling Baldrim's cloak with occasional fervor. One of his warriors cleared his throat but said nothing. Finally, Baldrim drew a shaky breath, forcing himself to stand tall.
Find that orc,
He ordered quietly. The following spring, Durzak and Rorgrim stood under the quiet light of a stone archway at a midnight hour. They had just come from a council meeting. A single lantern flickered from the arch's central pillar, casting wavering shadows across chiseled runes of dwarven ancestors. Rorgrim folded his arms within his scholarly robes, their patterns distinct in the lantern's glow. Here, he looked every bit as fierce as a warrior on a battlefield. Durzak stood opposite him, gloved hands gripping a rolled parchment that bore the crest of Thraegor. He exhaled a ragged breath.
Withdraw the levy,
He said, voice low but unyielding.
This library wing you propose, it'll bleed my miners dry. We barely recovered from the last expansion taxes.
Rorgrim met his glare.
I understand your concerns, truly.
He insisted, each word deliberate.
But you know my stance. Knowledge is the backbone of our realm. If we do not mine to our places of learning, we will inevitably be doomed through our own ignorance to repeat the mistakes of the past, or worse. Our archives must be complete, and to fund it.
Durzak cut him off with a sharp gesture.
Gold provides answers to all things, Rorgrim, not dusty tomes. Your levy is a direct blow to my operations. Can you imagine my people working back-breaking shifts, only to funnel their hard-earned coin into paper?
His voice flared.
Do you not see the insult?
Rorgrim's brow furrowed.
Is it so insulting to preserve our history, our treaties? You keep telling me resources must be spent wisely. Well, I say there's no wiser cause than ensuring dwarven knowledge survives. We can't swing a pickaxe at every problem.
Durzak gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw tightening.
Perhaps you should swing a pickaxe for once in your life, then maybe you'd know the cost of labor. You push a quill, I move mountains.
He paused, swallowing back heated words.
I'm asking you, no, I'm telling you, Withdraw that levy for the sake of my miners, for the sake of our brotherhood.
A hush settled in the corridor. The lantern flame flickered, its light casting elongated shadows of the two dwarves, one cloaked in scholarly attire, the other in boots stained by the earth. Rorgrim let out a measured sigh. Before he could speak, other footsteps echoed in the darkness. It was Belly.
I thought I might find you two here on a council meeting night.
Belly said coolly, stepping into the lantern's wavering circle. Damp patches of melted spring snow dotted his cloak, and a faint scent of wolf fur clung to him.
I'm glad you're both together. I need your help, desperately.
Rorgrim glanced at Durzak, then back to Belly.
What troubles you?
He asked softly, posture tense from the previous argument. Durzak looked away, almost knowingly. Belly inhaled, his voice catching slightly.
My wolves have been displaced again. Durzak's blasting have brought down their dens upon their heads. I am tired of digging wolf pups from rubble. If this keeps up...
He paused, gaze locking onto Durzak.
I need you to rein in those explosions, at least near my wolf dens.
Durzak frowned, crossing his arms with a stiff defensiveness.
We had no choice. The richest ore veins run through that section of rock. No one told your wolves to whelp in a potential mine shaft.
A flicker of anger lit Belly's eyes.
They were there long before you reopened it.
Durzak set his jaw, voice grinding with frustration.
You want me to ignore profit to save a few scraggly animals? You know how many families my mining supports. We're feeding half the city.
You could feed all of them without caving in dens.
Belly snapped back, fists curling at his sides.
All I'm asking is you blast somewhere else, or...
He paused.
Can you at least warn me first?
No.
Durzak said flatly, with maybe the slightest vein of guilt laced in his words.
Each day we delay, we lose coin, we lose contracts. If a blast needs doing, it needs doing on time. I can't have a negotiation each time a wolf howls.
Belly opened his mouth to retort, but Rorgrim spoke first, voice quiet yet resonant.
Durzak, these are living creatures. They guard caravans from predators. They're part of Belly's livelihood. If they suffer, many dwarves suffer. Belly suffers.
Durzak met Rorgrim's gaze with a stony glare.
I'm not sacrificing my mining schedule. Not for wolves. Not for Belly.
A tense silence fell. Belly's breath shook with simmering rage, but he simply drew back a step, shoulders taut.
I don't understand how you can be so...
He swallowed, searching for words.
We're done here.
He at last concluded, voice rigid. Without a backward glance, he turned and disappeared into the torchlit shadows. Durzak opened his mouth as if to yell after him, but Rorgrim lifted a hand to forestall him.
Durzak, you and I discussed a compromise before, but I just watched you refuse Belly's plea outright. Fine. It's what you think is best for the city, perhaps. But don't expect me to humor your request. I believe what I am doing is best for the city as well. Preserving our history is a work we must all participate in.
Durzak glared at him with clenched fists for a moment, before he pivoted and strode off in the same direction Belly had gone. Rorgrim sighed in the dark air and also headed down the stair in the same direction as his old friends, though at a far slower pace, as if reluctant to catch up. A full 13 months passed before the four dwarves sat in the same room together again. Golden candelabras lined the great hall, their flames bobbing in the steady excitement of a fresh feast. Along the high table, draped in crimson cloth, sat the four dwarf lords, Baldrim, Durzak, Belly, and Rorgrim. Dwarven royalty sat in ornamental mail all around them, raising tankards of ale in toast to King Jaral. Countless platters of roasted boar, smoked eels, and spiced roots filled the tables. Today, King Jaral would announce his successor. It would be one of the four old friends who would sit the throne of Thraegor. Rorgrim adjusted the scholarly pin on his cloak, sending a nervous glance at his companions. The silence was more than awkward.
A grand feast.
He remarked softly, nudging a plate of caramelized onions.
But no feast can fill the gap if we aren't united.
Durzak casually swirled his wine, catching the reflection of torchlight on the polished metal goblet. He half-turned to Rorgrim and muttered,
Now you care about unity when you think you're about to be crowned king? Where was that care for unity when I came to you last year?
Rorgrim looked exasperated. Durzak had not forgiven him for the levies.
I don't know who will be king, but I know that whoever it is, they cannot lead alone. Not well, at least. The king will need all of our support for the realm to be its strongest.
Well, we better hope it isn't Durzak then,
muttered Belly.
He's shown he cares more about coin than loyalty.
Aye. You're still not over your hounds, I see.
Durzak shrugged nonchalantly.
It wasn't personal.
Belly's face flared red.
My wolves are as personal as it gets, you greedy gold grabber.
Baldrim looked away as Belly mentioned his wolves, eyes filled with silent shame. Durzak hurled back at Belly.
My mines are the backbone of this kingdom. Without them, we'd have nothing.
That statement caused Baldrim's head to whip back with thinly veiled offense.
How many of your mines have my men protected from raiding parties this last decade?
He paused before continuing, more than half drunk.
If the kingdom knows what's good for its future, there's only one real possibility for today's coronation.
Durzak, clearly just as deep into his wine, didn't hesitate.
Indeed there is. I imagine the one who actually understands how commerce works would make the best fit. Everyone says it isn't about the money until they don't get paid.
Belly leaned forward, flame-lit eyes reflecting outrage.
Your leadership nearly buried half my wolf pack. Gold may be the answer for a great many of life's problems, but it won't buy you loyalty.
A moment of taut silence caught them all off guard, broken only by Baldrim's grunt of impatience.
Enough,
He said, as if someone had just been talking, words slurring slightly from ale.
I fought harder than any of you for it. I don't see how a miner's coin or a scholar's library can compare to standing shield to shield with dwarven brethren. If Jaral has sense, he'll see that might, and might alone will preserve a kingdom.
Durzak nodded mockingly.
Indeed. Today we will see which necessity the king values most, steel, scroll, or coin.
The omission of any of his skills being mentioned by either Baldrim or Durzak angered Belly more than his words could carry. They clearly did not consider him fit to be king, and both seemed to be oblivious that they had just said so to his face. He was under no illusion that he would be seriously considered, given the larger-than-life reputations of his three comrades, but to hear that they felt that way was a knife to his soul. He sat in silence for a moment before managing,
Neither of you wolf killers will be king today. There's only one here that has upheld the values of the wolf rider we once forged together all those years ago.
Here he looked at Rorgrim, who quickly averted his gaze uncomfortably.
Rorgrim should be king.
Rorgrim cleared his throat, cheeks coloring at Belly's pointed endorsement. He glanced around the table, suddenly aware that Durzak's knuckles whitened around his goblet, and Baldrim's lips tightened in a grim line. Their old bonds felt as fragile as a cracked hammer. Before another heated word could fly, a resounding blast of trumpets broke the tension. All across the great hall, dwarven lords paused with ale halfway to their lips, turning to see King Jaral rise from his gilded seat at the head of the dais. He leaned heavily on an ironwood cane wrapped in intricate runes, yet his voice carried across the chamber.
Lords and ladies of Thraegor.
Jaral began, ancient eyes scanning the sea of bearded faces.
This day marks the conclusion of my reign. A glorious one, but one that must yield to younger hearts, younger minds, and younger arms. I have consulted my council, weighed the needs of the mountain, and deemed it best that we name our next king.
A hush swept the hall, as though every breath caught in unison. Baldrim's chest rose with indignation, Durzak's gaze burned with fierce calculation, and Belly stared at his half-empty cup, refusing to let his own hurt color the moment. Rorgrim felt his pulse hammer in his ears. Jaral's cane tapped the marble floor, a subtle drumbeat to his words.
Thraegor's future demands more than a single skill. It requires unity of purpose and wise guidance. It requires knowledge and the wisdom to apply that knowledge across all facets of our prismatic kingdom. And so I name...
The king's voice wavered in the vast silence before he spoke the final words.
Rorgrim, son of the archives, scholar of dwarven lore, my successor and your future king.
Applause rippled through the hall, though it felt strangely distant to the four dwarves at the high table. Belly tried to smile for Rorgrim's sake, but the shadow of regret crossed his face that it had come to this in such bitterness. Durzak took a long, unsteady swig of wine before uttering a curt,
"So that's it then."
under his breath. Baldrim shoved his chair back from the table, the screech of wood grating on every ear in the hall.
You choose a scholar.
He muttered, jaw clenched.
We'll see how your archives fare when the next orc horde marches on these gates.
He cast Rorgrim a look of profound disappointment and turned on his heel, cloak swishing against the polished floor. Rorgrim rose stiffly, mind reeling.
Baldrim, wait.
He managed, but Baldrim was already striding away into the crowd, dwarves parting nervously before his grim countenance. Durzak set his goblet down with an audible clank and exhaled sharply, fixing Rorgrim with a weary stare.
I suppose your expansion of knowledge will continue then. Doubtless you expect my miners to foot the bill.
He shrugged with forced nonchalance.
But my oaths to Thraegor remain, King. I'll serve you for the realm's sake.
He kneeled and Belly followed amidst applause from the crowd. Belly stood, clearing his throat.
I said it should be you.
He said with great sincerity to Rorgrim, glancing sidelong at Durzak's anxious posture.
And I meant it. Coin might build walls, steel might hold them, but it's knowledge and wisdom that brings us and keeps us all together.
He hesitated for a moment before adding,
We'll need your patience, Rorgrim. We're dwarves, stubborn as stone.
Rorgrim tried to speak, but Belly shook his head.
Go to the dais. King Jaral's waiting.
As Rorgrim moved toward King Jaral, dwarven horns sounded loud in the hall. Parting lords and ladies congratulated him with eagerness. But in that moment, Rorgrim felt alone, alone with the full weight of a crown that had not yet touched his head. 2 winters had come and gone since Rorgrim took the throne of Thraegor. In that span, the city thrived more than many had predicted. Mines continued to reopen under Durzak's watchful eye. Wolf packs patrolled key passes at Belly's direction, reducing the number of surprise orc attacks. And the library wing, though scaled back to soothe tensions, still rose, stone by stone. Baldrim, after long weeks away on the frontier, returned to Thraegor and found Rorgrim eager to accept his apology and forgive his drunken outburst. Only in private had Baldrim apologized, and tersely, stating,
It doesn't matter what you think of me. What matters is who I am, and that wasn't me.
Rorgrim assured him that the throne needed a warrior's vigilance as much as a scholar's wisdom. On the morning of the library's formal dedication, Rorgrim hurried through a corridor filled with dwarven onlookers. His scholar's cloak, lighter now with simpler embroidery, trailed behind him. Durzak, arms folded over a rich crimson vest, waited at the far end of the hall with Belly by his side. Despite earlier rifts, the 2 dwarves spoke in muted, companionable tones. Rorgrim smiled at the sight.
You see,
He said as he approached,
our new library hasn't emptied your coffers yet, Durzak.
Durzak snorted, but not unkindly.
I made a few operational adjustments. My miners didn't starve after all.
He tilted his head toward Belly.
Though I suspect I've heard enough howling complaints about shaking wolf dens to last me a lifetime.
Belly's brows knitted.
Our agreement for you to warn me before any major blast has saved at least 3 litters.
A pause of thought, then he added,
That's more than we could say a year ago.
Rorgrim pushed forward and out into the old palace courtyard. It was filled with dwarves from every walk of life, miners with soot-stained tunics, soldiers on break from guard duty, and scholars clutching ink-stained scrolls. Ornate arches to their left led to newly carved doors, and masons brushed away fine dust from the last chisel marks, something Rorgrim had requested for dramatic effect to make the library feel newly minted. Rorgrim quietly looked around for Baldrim, frowning slightly.
He said he wouldn't miss this.
Durzak shrugged.
He'll be here.
He said flatly.
He keeps his word.
Rorgrim nodded and strode forward, preparing to make a speech. But before he could utter a word, a thunderous tremor shuddered through the courtyard. The braziers rattled on their mounts, and a shower of pebbles rained from the stone arches. The assembled dwarves gasped in surprise. Belly's voice caught in his throat.
That wasn't any normal quake.
Other dwarves nodded in agreement. A frantic guard sprinted in, breath ragged. My lord king, my men have spotted something near the gates. Rorgrim's expression hardened instantly.
Any sign of orcs? Trolls?
The guard shook his head, paling as he addressed the king. They spoke of a huge creature, he replied. Some think it was a worm. Rorgrim exchanged uneasy looks with the others.
We haven't seen a worm threat in centuries. Not since.
He pushed away his scholarly thoughts of old manuscripts, realizing he needed to focus on mobilizing right now.
Belly! Durzak!
But before he could finish, both of them were running away. On it, they said in unison, dashing off, panic already seizing the courtyard. Rorgrim aimed a last urgent glance at the empty space where Baldrim should have stood.
Where in the depths is he?
He wondered, before barking out orders to those around him. More and more quakes, some seemingly much nearer and larger than others, shook the cavern. He needed a better vantage point of the city to see what was happening. His heart pumping, Rorgrim took the stairs 2 at a time to reach the nearest balcony. Halfway up, the entire city thundered with the largest quake-like jolt yet, then another and another and another, each stronger than the one before it.
By Fenton's beard,
Rorgrim mumbled aloud.
So many earthquakes.
Rorgrim reached the top of the stairs and sprinted to the edge of the balcony. Gripping the stone balustrade, he peered over the city's bustling plaza and sucked in a sharp breath. Smoke filled the air as his citizens ran in every direction possible. Chandeliers of beaten iron shook violently overhead, and large rocks crashed down from above. That's when he first heard it. A deafening roar split the air, sending echoes down every corridor of Thraegor. Then he saw it, his heart skipping more than one beat, at the sight of an immense great worm with obsidian scales clawing through one of the lower stone gates. Flames poured from its maw, washing over fleeing citizens. He immediately spotted Belly crouched behind a toppled brazier, rifle in hand, a pack of iron-armored wolves snarling at his side. Each time one of the wolves started to bolt towards the beast, Belly barked a desperate order, warning them back to his side. As smoke and ash swirled in the torchlight, Rorgrim watched Belly fire multiple rounds, but each shot sparked off the impossibly thick worm hide with a hollow clang, leaving no mark. After the last bullet ricocheted harmlessly, Belly uttered a frustrated curse and abandoned the hopeless assault. Instead, he sprinted through the chaos, he and his wolves guiding panicked dwarven families out of collapsed archways and away from the fierce great worm. his wolves occasionally serving as a distraction to the great beast to save some desperate soul before leaping away to safety. Beli's wolves were undoubtedly smart. Durzak stood at the foot of a toppled statue, shoving aside wreckage to shield a huddled group of dwarves from the dragon's molten embers. He bellowed for his miners to gather their pickaxes or anything else they could find to fight the beast. This was no time to wait for trained warriors. Rorgrim realized he had to do something. He swallowed hard and rushed back down the stair he had just come up, this time the stair quaking beneath each footfall as if it might crumble. He dashed across the courtyard and down another stair out into the plaza. A handful of his palace guards had taken up to following him. Deep, thunderous footfalls rumbled across the plaza as Rorgrim's royal guard barreled into view, their gilded plate glinting in torchlight. A hopeful flutter passed through Rorgrim's chest at the sight of disciplined ranks forming against the massive worm. Axes and hammers rose high, defiant beneath the ancient halls of stone, now filled with blackened smoke. But the beast flicked its tail with a casual sweep, hurling the front line into those behind, sending armored dwarves tumbling down the stone steps like sacks of ore. Rorgrim stood frozen, horror roiling in his gut as the worm belched a liquid inferno that engulfed them all. 40 valiant dwarves, each man known to Rorgrim by name, vanished in a roar of blazing heat, leaving only reddened steel and charred remains. His throat constricted with grief and fury. Where was Baldrim Deep Axe, the greatest warrior of Thraegor, and his disciples of war, now that the halls screamed for salvation? He braced himself against a shattered statue base, then mustered the strength to bellow,
"We can't hold here. Retreat. Gather everyone."
With a chorus of anguished cries, 100 dwarves or more, straggled warriors, women clutching children, miners clutching broken tools, surged away from the plaza. Their soot-streaked faces glowed in the infernal light as they fled up the winding road away from the great worm. The creature gave chase behind them, spewing fire that devoured market stalls and shattered masonry. The great worm paused only to destroy everything it could along the way. Rorgrim coughed on scalding ash, but desperation forced him onward. What kind of king was he if he couldn't save his people?
"Head for House Deep Axe,"
he shouted, voice raw with urgency.
"Baldrim and his warriors will protect us."
If Baldrim could not come to them, they would go to Baldrim, he reasoned. Their numbers pressed together along a winding road, fear and flickering hope mingling in every sooty face. Smoke choked the passage, collapsing arcades crashed down from overhead, and frantic dwarves stumbled over loose stones. Rorgrim, Durzak, and Beli drew together at the head of the group, guiding the injured along.
"Have you seen him?"
Rorgrim demanded, his voice hoarse. Beli shook his head, cheeks streaked with grime.
No one has, and not a single warrior from his house.
Durzak hefted a soot-blackened pickaxe.
My miners seem to be our only warriors for now.
Then he paused before assuring,
But I am sure Baldrim will come.
Voice barely above a whisper. The company jogged ahead, stumbling on stones that had fallen from above. Dragging their wounded, they rounded the final bend before the great gates that led to the once siloed quarter of the city that had been under the leadership of House Deep Axe in the old days. The flickering glow illuminated a wall of stone looming ahead. As the company drew near, the truth became unmistakable. House Deep Axe's heavy stone gates stood sealed, impossibly thick. There were no welcoming sentries. No sign of reinforcements, only silence. Rorgrim's eyes widened in fear and desperation. He sprinted forward, heart pounding. He seized the heavy iron hammer used as a knocker and struck the ancient code. 3 thunderous blows, a long pause, 2 more, another pause, then 1 final ring. He waited, breath ragged, straining to hear the gate's hinges groan open. But no response came, only the distant rumble of the worm drawing closer. He backed away, eyes burning with betrayal. Durzak's jaw clenched as he raised his pickaxe. Belly trembled in fury, fists curling at his sides. Behind them, the remaining dwarves sagged in defeat, some dropping to their knees, others letting out despairing cries. The great worm's roar reverberated from the blackened city, an echo of doom steadily closing in. Rorgrim whispered in disbelief,
Baldrim locked his gates and left us here to burn.
Dozens of faces stared at the impenetrable walls in denial, while the creature's terrible roar shook the cavernous halls behind them. Betrayal twisted the pain in Rorgrim's chest as he realized there was nowhere left to run. Their only choice was to stand and fight against impossible odds, and to do so without the one dwarf they had believed would always protect them. Rorgrim turned to face his people, the charred ruins of his city sprawling before him. In the distance, a mother's agonized scream punctuated the fury burning in his veins. His voice wavered with anger and grief as he spat,
There is no safe haven. House Deepax has locked us out. We stand alone.
Durzak surveyed the ragged dwarves around them. Ash clung to his beard, and resignation weighed on every sooty face.
Then we spill the beast's blood here,
He growled, hefting the blackened pickaxe. A shudder of flame lit the dark as the terrible worm emerged into view around the bend, slowly plodding toward them. Citizens pressed against the sealed gates with nowhere left to run. Rage ignited in Rorgrim's eyes. He seized a spare pickaxe from a miner, all too glad to give it up, and marched forward, oblivious to the heat waves billowing from the dragon's hide. A few of Belly's wolves snarled at the worm, paws scrabbling over jagged stone. Belly shouted for them to stay close.
For Thraegor!
Rorgrim screamed, voice echoing off the high walls. The worm answered with a searing torrent of flames. Rorgrim dove and crouched low behind a short wall, shielding his face, letting the inferno roll past. A woman clutched her child to her chest, screaming. That was all it took for the wolves to spring into action on behalf of their dwarven packmates. They leapt forward, drawing the worm's gaze away from the woman, barely saving her, but two of them were snared in the edge of the inferno. Their tormented yelps tore at Belly's soul before going abruptly silent. Their reddened armor and blackened remains stood like terrible hellhounds in the darkness of the cavern around them. Baldrim, why? A pained Rorgrim whispered again and again in his mind, with a regretful pain he had never known before. What had driven one of his dearest friends to this shameful act of abandonment? Where had Rorgrim failed his friend so terribly? He shook himself, realizing he needed to focus purely on the dreadful task at hand. As he refocused his mind, something suddenly came back to him with the sudden intensity of a lightning bolt, something he had forgotten from more than a year earlier. It was a scrawled text from Fenton Thraegor's old war journal, read only in the king's secret chambers.
Strike between the plate scales where the neck meets the body. Slightest gap, surest kill. Distract it with a similar gap between its talons.
Rorgrim had glanced over it late one night, believing he would never need the knowledge. Now, heart stuttering with fearful excitement, he realized this revelation was all that stood between them and annihilation. He sprang forward the moment the inferno ebbed, pickaxe raised. Durzak and Belly and a handful of other miners followed.
Push in,
Durzak yelled.
We break through or die here.
The wolves, half of them now singed, snarled at the worm's haunches, causing him to whip around, his back to the dwarves. Belly had given up commanding them to retreat, though he knew their efforts were likely fruitless. But it was the wolves that gave Rorgrim the opening he needed. He darted beneath the worm's front leg, teeth clenched, remembering the ancient king's tactic. With all of his might, he slammed the pickaxe downward. A maddened shriek ripped from the creature's throat as Rorgrim's pickaxe found the gap. Though the talons looked impenetrable, right where they met, there must have been an unseen weak spot that his forebear had found so many years before. Fiery blood splattered upward, some landing on Rorgrim's shoulders, causing him to howl with burning pain. Another chorus of screams erupted from dwarven onlookers, children wailing for mothers, miners shouting hopelessly as the dragon writhed in pain with its fiery breath spraying every direction in unpredictable, pained movements. Yet Rorgrim managed to hammer the lesson home once more, bringing his pickaxe down again between a second set of the dragon's talons, sparks blooming where metal struck obsidian scale before descending beneath into soft flesh. This time, Rorgrim managed to avoid the fiery river that proceeded from the wound. Sweat slicked his brow as he shoved the pickaxe deeper this time, and the worm's roar reverberated so loudly that it was all Rorgrim could hear. The beast had lowered its head, its ears wildly searching for the cause of its suffering at its feet, though its eyes could see nothing. Just like the old manuscript had said, Rorgrim saw the opening at the base of the neck. He summoned every ounce of hatred and desperation within him and yanked the pickaxe free, swinging it in a high arc toward the opening in the creature's plating, guided by the memory of Thraegor's writings and fueled by the fury he felt at Baldrim's betrayal. The pickaxe found its mark with all the accuracy one would expect of a dwarven king under the Red Peak Mountains. The worm bellowed, thrashing uncontrollably before falling lifeless, its head at Rorgrim's feet, ghostly pale eyes fading to black. Panting and half-blinded by smoke, Rorgrim stepped back. Citizens stared in stunned relief. The monstrous roar ceased its echoes in the cavernous halls, replaced by much quieter crackling flames and ragged sobs. Burning dwarven corpses littered the ground all around them. His eyes rose to the towering gates of House Deepaxe, still barred, still silent. How many dwarves had died this day because of that locked gate? Bitterness stabbed through him. Baldrim had cast them aside. The ache of betrayal ebbed, replaced by unspeakable rage at his old friend. More than one dwarven life was due to be paid by Baldrim. Shakily, Durzak and Belly gathered near their king.
He never came.
Durzak whispered, chin quivering. Belly's eyes flicked from the worm's corpse to the barricaded gates.
We nearly died because of that coward.
He spat, voice trembling. Rorgrim's limbs quivered with rage, and his grip tightened around the pickaxe.
Durzak,
He growled.
bring your miners. Break down the gates of House Deepaxe. Smash them to pieces as small as sand. Baldrim will answer for this atrocity.
Rorgrim didn't wait before he himself took the first swing against the merciless stone gates. For 3 days, Thraegor's scorched streets lay under a pall of smoke. Durzak's miners pounded at Baldrim's gates with chisels and sledgehammers, each strike an echo of dwarven wrath. Rorgrim walked the ruined courtyard, jaw clenched as anger flamed in his chest without subsiding. Belly lingered by the rubble, silent and grim, occasionally speaking low words of comfort to wounded survivors. None of the old friends could escape the thought that pounded their minds like a hammer striking an anvil. Baldrim turned his back when we needed him. He hid behind his gates in our hour of greatest need. At last, a final crash reverberated through the halls. The colossal stone gate to the old part of the city groaned, crumbling in a cloud of gritty dust. Iron plating peeled away with a grinding shriek, and Durzak wrenched the remainder of it aside, bearing a gaping hole. Rorgrim moved in first, Belly at his shoulder, torches flickering in the dense fog of dust from the collapsing gate. Rows of warrior after warrior stood ready to answer Rorgrim's call. He motioned for them to stay where they were. The dwarven king who had faced a worm now intended to face his old friend. Though it broke his heart, he imagined his brother would fare no better against him than the beast that had assaulted their city. No words could save him now. Passing this judgment was his kingly duty, or he could not be seen as a king at all by his people. Smoke filled the darkened chamber where they now stood. What they saw stole the breath from their lungs. A horrible stillness draped over a ruined city. Where once proud buildings had stretched into the distance, only blackened skeletons of crushed beams remained. Arches caved in. Walls collapsed into smoldering heaps. Thick ash coated the ground, crunching underfoot like brittle leaves. The air burned their lungs, and the acrid scent of char and sulfur stung their eyes.
Sweet Maker,
Belly whispered, taking in the devastation. No corner escaped ruin. An entire quarter of the city was now little more than collapsed wreckage. They trudged up the pathway toward the great house of Deep Axe, at the center of the quarter, in awe-struck silence. Durzak got there first, his flickering torchlight providing a revelation to them all. Rank after rank of the distinct fallen armor and shields of the warriors of House Deep Axe lay in the streets, blackened corpses crisped underneath. The great house of Deep Axe itself lay reduced to cinders, walls charred black, support beams torn down, ceilings slumped in smoldering heaps. Stone was smashed and wood was burned. Nothing was left as it was before. Nothing was untouched by flame. In the middle of the old great and proud house that had stood for millennia as Baldrim's ancestral home, right where the great hall used to be, were not one but two monstrous shapes sprawled at awkward angles against fallen pillars, great worms, each dwarfing the one they had slain. Their obsidian scales gleamed in the half-light, thick black blood pooling near their contorted limbs. One worm's jaw remained clenched around a shattered archway, frozen in death throes. Between the two worms was an impossible vision, a charred but unmistakable single figure of a familiar armored warrior clutching a great axe in one hand, buried deep in the chest of one of the great worms, and a mighty hammer in his other hand. Its massive steel face lay atop the other worm's flattened head.
Baldrim,
Rorgrim murmured. The blackened knight somehow still stood. Belly realized with a gasp that his armor had been melted and reforged where he stood, now a silent, broken sentinel in the house of his fathers. Durzak pressed a sooty rag to his mouth.
He killed two of them.
He rasped, fascinated horror dancing in his voice. Belly's expression darkened.
While we faced one, he locked two inside with him.
Rorgrim's heart twisted with the realization that Baldrim hadn't locked them out. He locked them in. In that moment, he could not speak. Tears fell silently from his ash-covered face for several minutes before he touched the shoulder of Baldrim's ruined breastplate. Guilt flooded his voice as he whispered,
I thought the worst of him while he was dying for us.
Shame burned hotter than any worm's flame inside of Rorgrim's heart. He brushed trembling fingers over the crest on Baldrim's chest as a small, instantly recognizable trinket fell to the ground from Baldrim's ruined waistband. It was the symbol they had forged together all those years before, and its unexpected appearance was enough to bring all three of the dwarven lords into a shared wail. They cried long and loud. It was possible that never before had three grown dwarven men cried like that together within the halls of Thraegor. As their cries faded, sudden movement to their right caused them all to jump. A small figure crawled out from under a collapsed column. It was Baldrim's son. "Father," he choked, stumbling forward. Belly immediately tried to shield the boy from the sight, but it was too late. He had seen it. His cries were just as loud as the older dwarves had been moments before. Belly knelt down, cradling the sobbing boy's shoulders. Durzak stood, transfixed, torch quivering in his hand. Rorgrim fought a swell of remorse so fierce it felt like a physical blow. Baldrim had sacrificed himself, sealing 2 gargantuan worms away from the rest of the city at the cost of his own life. Then he destroyed them both in open combat in a way that no one even knew was possible.
Songs will be sung about this.
Belly encouraged the child.
Your father is a hero.
He trailed off. Rorgrim moved in and scooped up the boy in his arms and held him tight, hugging him the way he wished he could hug Baldrim. The boy looked up at Rorgrim, maybe half the age that his father had been when they had made their fateful pact. The boy inquired tearfully. Father said this was the only way to save everyone. Did he do it? Rorgrim smiled at the boy.
Yes, he did. He saved everyone.
He echoed quietly. Rorgrim's bitter anger had shattered, replaced by stunned reverence and deep regret. In the deepest cavern of Thraegor, where the legendary Fenton Thraegor himself had once battled fierce worms, and now which served as his final resting place, the dwarves mourned Baldrim's death in quiet unison. Flickering torches were swallowed up into the descending darkness as they stood before what seemed to be a bottomless hole into the heart of the earth. Dozens of survivors, still bearing soot and bandages, lined the route. Baldrim's body, wrapped in linen and set atop a stone bier, awaited its final descent. Dwarven royal tombs were merely abysses with a stone epitaph set above it. Digging them took months, some years. The deepest tombs were saved for the highest of royalty, and Rorgrim had commanded them to use the deepest one, right next to Fenton Thraegor himself, a hole that had been preserved for hundreds of years for an until now undetermined particularly heroic dwarf. Rorgrim stood at the brink, eyes red. Durzak and Belly lingered at his sides. Dwarves all around kept solemn vigil, their heads bowed.
Baldrim will lie here beside Thraegor,
Rorgrim announced, voice unsteady.
I decree his epitaph shall read, the mightiest warrior and most loyal friend to have ever lived.
Just then, his old friend's words came back to him.
It doesn't matter what you think of me. What matters is who I am.
And Rorgrim broke down one last time into violent tears of unshakable grief. As his wails faded, a deep dwarven dirge began, a rising hum of many voices, with Belly taking the lead, echoing seeming endlessly in the cavern.
Everywhere that stone meets flame, may dwarven hearts sing his name. His soul now sleeps in hallowed halls, a mighty roar that never falls. Let him rest where legends dwell. Halls of Thraegor guard him well. Granite walls tales in songs are told. With axe in hand, he paid the cost. A brother found, a brother lost. A hammer's echo in the deep. This warrior finds eternal sleep.
Silence draped the cavern in the final moment before Baldrim's stone bier was tilted over the ledge and released. Rorgrim pulled an old figurine from his pouch, the same one Baldrim had clutched in his final moments. He took out his own copy in his other hand. His hands shook as he held them both over the tomb.
We were not worthy of his friendship.
With an anguished cry, he dropped both figurines into the fathomless chasm below. Durzak and Belly followed, wordlessly letting their own tokens tumble into the darkness, each of the Wolf Rider keepsakes silently holding a triumphant axe high above their heads. In that hallowed silence, they all knew Baldrim's sacrifice would echo through the ages, a testament to the unbreakable bonds of dwarven kinship, bonds they had all but forsaken in their darkest hours. This concludes Hearts of Stone by C.T. Stewart.